Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the first task for our Gatekeeper config. We're instructed to provision, looking at iOS H323 Gatekeeper, to provision the corporate headquarter router 1 as an H323 Gatekeeper using the following specifications. We're told to use the loopback 0 as the source of all Gatekeeper RAS traffic. We're told to create 2 zones, call one SEA for Seattle, that's going to be the headquarters one, and the other one called AMS for Amsterdam, both with the domain name of ine.com. Okay, so let's just bring up our router terminal here. And we'll begin configuration, config T, jump into Gatekeeper. By the way, for most commands, show, debug, and configuration, GATEK is the non-ambiguous form because GATEW could be a gateway. So we type out the whole thing as long as it's non-ambiguous. And the first thing, if we do show run pipe to section Gatekeeper, or Gatekeeper, we'll see that by default, Gatekeeper is in a shutdown state, no configuration. All right, so far so good. So we'll define our 2 local zones that we were instructed to. We're told to create 2 local zones, one SEA and one AMS, both with the domain name of INE. Okay, zone local, not zone, zone local, SEA, question mark. I'm not going to do question mark throughout the whole thing, but you can to see what goes where at various points. Then we want domain name, so ine.com. And then we have to specify the IP address. Okay, we only need to put it in once. All the other local zones that we create, we do not need to continue to type in zone local. I'm sorry, we don't need to continue to type in the IP address. We'll do zone local. We will put in the name of the zone, and we do have to have, it'll take the command without, typically, older iOS versions took it without the domain name. It looks like this one does not. Maybe after the first one it will. But we don't need to keep putting the IP address in. If we put the same IP address in, no harm. If we put different IP addresses in, the Gatekeeper can only be sourced from one IP address. All the RAS traffic can only be sourced from one IP. So it will override any previous IPs that you've put in. You cannot tie different zones to different IP addresses. They all have to be tied to Gatekeeper as a H225 RAS protocol being sourced from one local router source IP address. And we were told to use the loopback 0 as the source. So if I try to put this in, it's actually going to let me, but I'll do a do show IP interface brief, pipe to exclude unassigned. Have IPs. Here's my loopback 0. It's got the IP, I'll just copy and paste, of 177.1.254.1. So we'll put in the zone local SEA ine.com command again and give it the IP address. Now we'll create another local zone we were instructed called AMS, Amsterdam.ine.com. Now do show run, pipe to section Gatekeeper. Unfamiliar with the output modifier, B begins with. Pipe is the output modifiers, B begins with, I includes, E excludes, and S shows us an entire section and subsection. If I just did include Gatekeeper, it would only show me this word. It shows me everything in the subsection. Okay, at this point I could go ahead and no shut it. Now I can go ahead and say let's actually just end out, and let's say show Gatekeeper status. I see, okay, I've got a number of show Gatekeeper commands. Calls, circuits, clusters, we'll look at those. GW type, okay, gateway technology prefix, what the GW type command is. Performance statistics, server information, current Gatekeeper status, and then also information about particular zones. So show gatekeeper shows that it's up, got a couple local zones, the license is available, endpoint throttling, there's no security, and there's no CAC, call admission control. We'll actually get into that. Could also do show gatekeeper zone, information about the cluster, the prefix, but we haven't entered any of that yet, so I could just do show zone, show gatekeeper zone status, and I'll see two zones. This is all the information for Seattle, and this is all the information for AMS. By the way, note the column header here. This says gatekeeper name. That's because depending on what Cisco documentation you look at, or depending on where you're actually looking in iOS or CUCM, web user interface, some places refer to this as the zone name, and some refer to it as the gatekeeper name. So you'll hear me throughout the rest of the lecture, and now that we've gone over this deep dive, throughout the rest of the deep dives, use the terms interchangeably, gatekeeper name and zone name. I'll use them interchangeably. Okay, so when we were just configuring things, go back and do a show run pipe to section gatekeeper, they're called zones, right? But the reason I want to draw this draw attention to this very distinctly is I don't want anyone thinking that when in the future I refer to gatekeeper name that I'm possibly referring to the host name of the router. It has nothing to do with the host name of the router at all. By the way, sea.domainname.com does not need to be a fully qualified domain name, does not need to route properly with DNS. It's not exactly like SIP that desires to rely on DNS. It's not a bad idea to make sure the gatekeeper name plus the domain name is a fully qualified DNS name, but it's not necessary. Nothing we'll do here today relies on DNS. However, I still have to have a domain name. Okay. Note the IP address that I tied into my first zone, Seattle, okay, for my configuration. This zone local doesn't have an IP address, but note in the show gatekeeper zone status, it inherited the same IP address as its source for the gatekeeper sending out, reject and confirm messages, and also as the destination for the gatekeeper receiving request messages. And we'll see those messages with a debug RAS. We'll go ahead and turn on debug RAS. Okay, let's see, show deb, let's see, okay, good, that's the only debug running. Okay, so we've got a basic configuration, but we've met the requirements of task 1.